Welcome home to Passionate Justice 83 on Our Salon Radio. Thank you all of you, for your continuing and growing support. You know, this transition to Our Salon Radio exclusively has been and will be, with your help, well, it'll continue to be seamless and so much fun, and soon we hope you'll have so many listening possibilities at Our Salon Radio. So stay alert. Reach out to me on Twitter at jwolf41387 for all Passionate Justice news, releases, podcasts. I ask all of you, follow the show on Twitter at jwolf41387. Now, a new hour. Personal notes, super guest writers spurring you on every week, every day, a challenge to create a little more justice in our world. And join Our Salon, where you hear Passionate Justice. It's the very best readers and writers hub on the net, growing, created, and hosted by California's Lori Wright, and it is free. Join now at www.oursalon.com. So here's a question. What have been the effects of food stamp cuts on our older poor, our elderly poor? Well, HuffPo's Arthur Delaney answers that question this way. He asked a woman called Judy Beals of Belleville, Wisconsin. Well, she was getting ready to pay for her groceries at the store earlier this year when she found out that her monthly food stamp benefits had been slashed from $120 to $16. Ms. Beals said, "I was never notified." And Ms. Beal is 65 years old, a year older than I am. Calling around to various state offices, she said she was told her benefits would not have gone down if she'd been able to document her heating bills by providing the state with her utility bills. And Ms. Beal says this was news to her. See, in an effort to cut spending on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, Congress last year, and that's of course what we used to call food stamps, Congress last year passed a law changing the way states can factor in utility costs to determine food stamp eligibility. Now, most affected states acted to prevent benefits from being cut. Presidential candidate and Wisconsin governor and his legislature, Scott Walker, well, they did not. The Hunger Task Force, which is a Milwaukee-based nonprofit that opposes the cuts, estimates that 255,000 Wisconsin families have seen benefit reductions, serious ones. Seniors and people with disabilities have been disproportionately affected. The hunger activists are deeply concerned about people whose incomes will never change, who are living on Social Security income or a small pension. In testimony before the United States House Agricultural Committee last month, the task force activists recounted stories of seniors forced into homelessness by this new policy. Is that what we want? Well, this week, Wisconsin State Reps David Bowen and Jonathan Brostov introduced legislation to undo the cuts, but their bills face long odds in a Wisconsin legislature that's been preoccupied with restricting food stamp benefits, not maintaining or expanding them. And as Governor Scott Walker campaigned for re-election, partly on the idea that food stamp recipients ought to be tested for illegal drug use, where do you think this is going to go? It really is just punishing people who are poor. We're talking about people in poverty not having nearly enough to eat. The cuts came about because Republicans in Congress wanted to stop states from boosting their residents' federal SNAP benefit by giving them token enrollment in the much smaller low-income home energy assistance program. See, makes them look good, and they're doing bad. Food stamps, people you see who, these applicants who also qualified for federal heating assistance, Federal law allowed states to automatically subtract a significant amount of the calculation of an applicant's gross monthly income, thereby making the applicant eligible for a larger SNAP benefit at little cost to the state. To take advantage of this heat and eat scheme, and it is a scheme, Wisconsin had been automatically signing up all SNAP applicants for $1 of heating assistance a year. $1 of heating assistance a year. When Congress said states couldn't increase food stamp benefits based on anything less than $20 in heating assistance, 11 of the 15 states affected boosted the amount of heating assistance they were giving out. But Wisconsin went the other way, implementing the cuts on a rolling basis for new SNAP applicants and for existing enrollees when it came time to recertify that they were still poor enough to qualify. The Congressional Budget Office, you've heard of it, it's called the CBO, and it's nonpartisan, estimated last year that the heat and eat cut would save $8 billion in federal spending over 10 years, roughly 1% of SNAP spending over that same period, and the cut would affect how many Americans? Well, just under 1 million. Ms. Beals said she never signed up for heating assistance. The notification letter sent out by the Wisconsin government simply announced that the state is increasing its estimate of a person's income because of his or her utility. Their expenses went down. Ms. Beals gets by on how much a month? $956 in Social Security payments. So losing more than $100 in nutrition assistance is a real hit to her, and it causes her to fall behind on other bills, and she's got fibromyalgia and diabetes and migraines. The government didn't give her that, but look what they're not doing to help. She's been receiving SNAP, which in Wisconsin is called Food Share, for the past 3 years, she said. And so what's happening to her? She says, quote, I'm eating once a day. I would love to be able to pay my bills. I would love to be able to pay my bills, but I couldn't because the Food Share thing made me have everything begin to fall apart. And I need to tell you out there, the Wisconsin governor, Scott Walker, well, right now, in numbers of polls, he's the Republican presidential front runner. Now, you will recall our friend, poet John Guzlowski of Danville, Virginia, his memory pieces from Chicago, his hometown. Well, dig this. John's just had a novel published. A brilliant and gorgeous and gruesome novel, Suitcase Charlie. Now, in this piece, John tells us how he came to write it. But first, on the cover. Now, close your eyes. I want you to think. I want you to think of those hallowed pulp novel covers from the 40s and 50s. And a man in a fedora and an overcoat lighting a cigarette. Urban skyline in the background, red and black sky, and a suitcase. Red drips ooze from the suitcase where it latches, and these words on the cover above the title. In 1950s Chicago, suitcases start appearing on dark street corners and in quiet city parks. Their contents, dead children. Suitcase Charlie and Me. John tells us, I started writing my novel Suitcase Charlie about 60 years ago when I was 7 years old, just a kid. At that time, I was living in a working-class neighborhood on the near northwest side of Chicago, an area sometimes called Humboldt Park, sometimes called the Polish Triangle. A lot of my neighbors were Holocaust survivors, World War II refugees, and displaced persons. They were hardware store clerks with Auschwitz tattoos on their wrists, Polish cavalry officers who still mourned for their dead comrades, and women who had walked from Siberia to Iran to escape the Russian Gulag. They were our moms and dads. Some of us kids had been born here in the States, but most of us had come over to America in the late 40s and early 50s on U.S. troop ships when the U.S. started letting us refugees in. And as kids, we knew a lot about fear. We heard about it from our parents. They had seen their mothers and fathers shot, their brothers and sisters put on trains and sent to concentration camps, their childhood friends left behind crying on the side of a road. Most of our parents didn't tell us about this stuff directly. How could they? How could they? But we felt their fear anyway. We overheard their stories late at night when they thought we were watching TV in a far-off room or sleeping in bed, and that's when they'd gather around the kitchen table and start remembering the past and all the things that made them fearful. My mom would tell about what happened to her mom and her sister's baby when the Germans came to her house in the woods, the rapes and murders. You could hear the fear in my mom's voice. She feared everything. The sky in the morning, a drink of water, a sparrow singing in a dream, me whistling some stupid little Mickey Mouse Club tune I'd picked up on TV. Sometimes when I was a kid, if I started to whistle, she would ask me to stop because she was afraid that that kind of simple act of joy would bring the devil into the house. Really. My dad was the same way. If he walked into a room where my sister and I were watching some TV show about World War II, even something as innocuous as the sitcom Hogan's Heroes, and there were some German soldiers on the screen, his hands would clench up into fists, his face would redden in anger, and he would tell us to turn the show off immediately. Normally the sweetest guy in the world, his fear would turn him toward anger, and he would start telling us about the terrible things the Germans did, the women he saw bayoneted, the friends he saw castrated and beaten to death, the men he saw frozen to death during a simple roll call. This was what it was like at home for most of my friends and me. To escape our parents' fear, however, we didn't have to do much. We just had to go outside and be around other kids. We could forget the war and our parents' fear with them. We'd laugh, play tag and hide and go seek, climb on fences, play softball in the nearby park, go to the corner store for an ice cream cone or a chocolate soda, you name it. This was the mid-50s at the height of the baby boom, and there were millions of us kids outside, living large, and as my dad liked to say, running around like wild goats in the streets with our friends. We didn't know a thing about fear, didn't have to think about it. That is, until Suitcase Charlie showed up one day. It happened in the fall of 1955, October. A Sunday afternoon, 3 young Chicago boys, 13-year-old John Schuessler, his 11-year-old brother Anton, and their 14-year-old friend Bobby Peterson, went to downtown Chicago, the area called the Loop, to see a matinee of a Disney nature documentary called The African Lion. Today, the parents of the boys probably would take them to the Loop, but back then it was a different story. Their parents knew where they were going, and the mother of the Schuessler boys, in fact, had picked out the film they would see and given the brothers the money to pay for the tickets. At one time, it wasn't that unusual for kids to be doing this kind of roaming around on their own. We were free-range kids before the term was even invented. Every one of our friends was a latchkey kid. Our parents figured that we could pretty much stay out of trouble no matter where we went. We'd take buses to museums, beaches, movies, swimming pools, amusement parks without any kind of parental guidance. There were times we'd even just walk a mile to a movie to save the 10 cents on the bus ride. We'd seldom do this alone, however. Kids had brothers and sisters and pals, so we'd do what the Schuessler brothers and their friend Bobby Peterson did. We'd get on a bus, go downtown, see a movie, hang out there. Afterward, There was plenty to do, and most of it didn't cost a penny. There were free museums, enormous department stores filled with toy departments where you could play for hours with all the toys your parents could never afford to buy you, libraries filled with books and Civil War artifacts, real ones, a Greyhound bus depot packed with arcade-style games, a dazzling lakefront full of yachts and sailboats, comic book stores, dime stores where Barkers would try to sell you impossible nonstick pans and sponges that would clean anything, and skyscrapers like the Prudential Building where you could ride non-stop lickety-split elevators from the first floor to the 41st for free. And if you got tired of all that, you could always stop and look at the wild people in the streets. It was easy for a bunch of parent-free kids to spend an afternoon down in the Loop just goofing off and checking stuff out, just like the Schussler brothers and their friend Bobby Peterson did. But the brothers and Bobby never made it home from the Loop that Sunday in October 1955. 2 days later, their dead bodies were found in a shallow ditch just east of the Des Plaines River. The boys were bound up and naked. Their eyes were closed, shut with adhesive tape. Bobby Peterson had been beaten and the bodies of all three thrown out of a vehicle. The coroner pronounced the cause of death asphyxiation by suffocation. The city thrown into a panic. For the first time, we kids felt the same kind of fear outside the house we'd seen inside. Shook us up. Where before we hung out on the street corners and played games till late in the evening, now we came home when the first street lights came on. We also started spending more time at home or at the homes of our friends, and we stopped doing as many things on our own out on the street. Fewer trips to the supermarket or the corner store or the two local movie theaters, the Crystal and the Vision. The street wasn't the safe place it had once been. Everything changed, and now we were conscious of threat, of danger, of the type of terrible thing that could happen almost immediately to shake us and our world up. We started watching for the killer of the Schussler brothers and Bobby Peterson. We didn't know his name or what he looked like. Nobody did, but we gave him a name, and we had a sense of what he might look like. We called him Charlie, and we were sure he hauled around a suitcase, one that he carried dead children in. Just about every evening as it started getting dark, some kid would look down the street toward the shadows at the end of the block, toward where the park was, and see something in those shadows. The kid would point and ask in a whisper, "Suitcase Charlie?" We'd follow his gaze, and a minute later we'd be heading for home, fast as we could. Now, the novel Suitcase Charlie is available on Kindle or in paperback. I want you to look for Suitcase Charlie on Amazon and in bookstores. And here's a real treat. I'm going to share with you the opening of Suitcase Charlie. Prologue, October 18th, 1955, Associated Press wire. The bodies of 3 boys were found nude and dumped in a ditch near Chicago today at 12:15 p.m. They were Robert Peterson, 14, John Schussler, 13, and brother Anton Schussler, 11. They'd been beaten and their eyes taped shut. The boys were last seen walking home from a downtown movie theater where they had gone to see The African Lion. 7 months later, Wednesday, May 30, Chapter 1. There wasn't any point in hurrying. By the time Hank Purcell and his partner Marvin Bondarowitz got there that night, they couldn't even get close. For a block in every direction, it was like a midnight cop convention. The new black and white squad cars, with their red lights twirling and lighting up the darkness, were scattered along all the streets leading to the intersection, and a mob of detectives and uniformed cops were there, some standing around sweating in the heat, others swarming and going nowhere. Hank couldn't imagine what the beef was, why they'd need so many cops, but He had the parked car, and so he drove down Rockwell toward Division and finally double parked a couple blocks south of where the action was. Then he and Marvin started hoofing it back. When they finally got to the intersection, it was cordoned off. Hank pulled his handkerchief out of his pocket, wiped his face, and looked around. Yellow police barricades kept the folks who were still awake out of the intersection and on the sidewalks. It was quite a crowd. At the White Eagle Tap, the corner Polack bar, the drunks and third-shift drinkers stood in the doorway watching the commotion. Some had beer bottles in their hands. Kids were sitting on the barricades, craning their necks and bopping up and down to see what was up. The windows in the apartment building fronting 3 of the corners had a few lookers in them, old guys watching and smoking, young girls and women in bathrobes and curlers, rubberneckers, looky-loos. Hank wasn't surprised. He'd seen crowds like this before. At accidents and fires, shootings even. What surprised Hank was that there wasn't a lot of talking or shouting here. Even when they were pulling bodies out of flip taxis and burning buses, you could hear some kind of yakking, shouting, crying, moaning even, but there wasn't anything like that here. All Hank could hear was a low buzz, the kind of human hum he remembered hearing at the ball field when the Cubs were losing, or maybe at a church when the priest was trying to talk the congregation into donating more money so their souls wouldn't scorch so long in hell. It was that kind of buzz. Hank wiped the sweat off his neck with his handkerchief and tried to figure out what was going on. Some cops were coming in, some were going out. A darkened ambulance with its back doors swung wide open stood off about 20 feet down Evergreen Street. The 3 medics stood with their backs to him, but there was enough light from a street lamp so Hank could see they were smoking. Their heads were together. They were probably talking too. At the northwest corner where the nuns' convent stood, Hank saw a half-dozen cops, officers and detectives mostly. They were clustered around something. He spotted his boss, Lieutenant Frank O'Herlihy, on the outskirts of the bunch and poked Marvin's shoulder. "Come on." Hank started across the street, and Marvin followed. Captain Felt from the 5th Division Shakespeare Station was talking. Hank saw him jerking his head and yammering. The rest of the brass were listening. Felt was worked up, agitated, like he'd just got demoted or shifted over to one of the colored precincts down on the south side of Chicago in the Bronzeville section. Hank eased next to him and listened. Felt was blabbering the stuff cops always blabber. "Jesus Christ, we'll get the son of a bitch bastard." Then Captain Felt stopped jerking his head and looked down at the sidewalk. Hank followed his eyes. A brown suitcase lay open on the sidewalk at Captain's feet. There was something in it, but Hank couldn't tell what it was. The shadows of the detectives and the uniformed cops clustered around made it difficult for him to figure it out. He wanted to ask, but didn't. Instead, he leaned a little closer and inched his head forward. Then he wished he hadn't. Hank spun around and threw up into the gutter. The beer he had with Marvin in the alley a while ago was the first to go. Flat and raw, it came up hard. The acid at the bottom of his stomach poured up next, quick as a flush toilet, all hot and burning and twisting his stomach. It was doing what it wanted to do. It churned and brought up just about everything had left in him that wasn't tied to his insides. Bent over, his hands on his knees, he started coughing and tried to spit the acid out of his mouth and throat. Marvin was next to him then, holding Hank by his shoulders, steadying him as his lungs kept hacking and his head kept jerking. Marvin whispered, "What the hell, Hank? What the hell?" Hank didn't say anything, couldn't say anything. He tried to clear his throat, and he couldn't do that either. He threw up some more of whatever was left in his guts. Finally, he stood up a little straighter and used his sweat-damped handkerchief to wipe the vomit from his mouth and hands. "There's a dead kid in the suitcase," Hank said. "Dead kid? You're crazy, man," Marvin said as he turned around slowly. Hank followed him back to the suitcase. Some of the cops had drifted away while he was puking. Others had come up to take their place. Everybody had to take a good, solid look, get an eyeful, like there was something here that nobody had ever seen before, some kind of evil that was one of a kind, fresh and original down to its buttons. The suitcase was light brown, used but not old, and it wasn't very large, about 2 feet by 3 feet, big enough to hold a child. And now Hank could see what he couldn't see before. The kid in it was a boy, not a girl. Hank could tell because the kid was naked, not a stitch of clothes on, and his body was twisted, arms, feet, shoulders, hands, all twisted up like clean rags. The bones had been broken or chopped up before the body had been shoved into the suitcase. Hank could see that the left foot was pressed against the chin, the head was turned face up, and the right shoulder was placed so that it pointed away from the head. Hank looked at the boy's face now. His eyes were staring straight up at him, the mouth hung open in a funny way. Before he stuck the boy in the suitcase, the killer must have broken his jaw and drained the blood out of the poor kid. The child was yellow, his face, his hands, his feet, all yellow, the color you get when there's no blood to keep you alive, and pink. The kid looked like a baby bird that had fallen from a nest in a high tree, a baby bird without feathers. Hank couldn't turn away. Jesus, Marvin said as he stared down at the dead child. Captain Felt looked at him. Yeah, Jesus Christ, you're going to puke too like your pussy friend here? Marvin couldn't say anything except, Jesus Christ. Hank stared some more at the kid in the suitcase and shook his head. He wanted to know why all the cops were standing around staring at the kid. What kind of sense did that make? They should be out tracking down the killer, pounding him when they found him, smashing bricks against his head, shoving iron pipes up his ass. He looked at Lieutenant O'Herlihy, his boss. What do you want us to do? O'Herlihy looked at him and said, fuck. And then he didn't say anything for a long time. Hank knew the lieutenant. He was a good man, clean like a Boy Scout, a church-loving Roman Catholic. He was like the old broads at St. Fidelis up the street who sat in the back pews and mumbled over the rosary beads, a guy who took any kind of looseness as an insult before God, his personal father. O'Herlihy didn't appreciate cursing, so his fuck hung in the air between the three men and echoed like a woman's scream in the dark, repeating itself over and over in pain. Then the lieutenant shook his head and said, you know the neighborhood here, Hank. Start talking to people. See if they saw anything tonight. It was hot, so there were lots of people out. See if anyone saw a guy carrying this brown suitcase. Hank nodded. And when you find him, I want you to hurt him. Hank nodded again. We'll hurt him. Now. Oh, I want you to get John Guzlowski's new crime novel, Suitcase Charlie. Now from the Chicago Catholic enclaves of the mid-1950s in John's novel to another very contemporary one. Now that the Irish vote on same-sex marriage is past the headlines phase, I want to share this with you, and it's from a source that I've referenced before on Passionate Justice. It's really terrific. It's called Religious Dispatches. This is from Peter Montgomery, and he says this, that the Irish vote reflects diminished moral authority of the Catholic Church. I want you to give it some consideration, and you'll tell me what you think. He says Irish voters turned out in huge numbers, cast their vote 62 to 38 in favor of amending the country's constitution to allow same-sex couples to marry, and making the overwhelmingly Catholic Ireland the first in the world to legalize marriage for same-sex couples through a national referendum. Now, other church-affiliated nations, such as Spain, have had equality for some time, but through their legislatures. Many Catholics wonder what right the Catholic Church has to oppose gay marriage when those charged with proclaiming and upholding Christian morality were abusing children there. And after the vote, the Irish Sun newspaper said in an editorial, Ireland officially emerged from the shadow of the Catholic Church yesterday to show its love and respect to people who have suffered here for centuries. Dublin Archbishop Diarmuid Martin said the Church needs to take a reality check and reconnect with its young people. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called the vote a historic moment for human rights, and writing in the Irish Times, Fintan O'Toole said it looks ordinary, really ordinary, even though on the surface it may look extraordinary. Little Ireland becoming the first country in the world to support same-sex marriage by direct popular vote. But again, it actually is about the ordinary. Ireland has redefined what it means to be an ordinary human being. We've made it clear to the world that there's a new normal, that ordinary is a big, capacious word that embraces and rejoices in the natural diversity of humanity. LGBT people are now a fully acknowledged part of the wonderful ordinariness of Irish life. It looks like a victory for tolerance, but actually, it's an end to mere toleration. Tolerance is what we extend to them, you see. It's about saying, you do your own thing over there, and we won't bother you so long as you don't bother us. The resounding yes vote is a statement that Ireland has left tolerance far behind. I really want you to think about this, people. Really think about it. The resounding yes vote is a statement that Ireland has left tolerance far behind. It's like saying there's no them anymore. LGBT people are us, our sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, neighbors, friends. We were given the chance to say that. We were asked to replace tolerance with the equality of citizenship. And we took it in both arms and hugged it close. O'Toole praises the riveting eloquence of marriage equality advocates, including people who sacrificed their privacy and exposed their most intimate selves to the possibility of public rejection. Their courage and dignity made the difference. Even so, this is not a victory for articulate statement. Deep down, you see, it's a victory for halting, fretful speech. Deep down, it is a victory for halting, fretful speech. How is that? Because what actually changed Ireland over the past 2 decades is hundreds of thousands of painful, stammered conversations that began with the words, "I've something to tell you." It's all those moments of coming out around kitchen tables, tentative words punctuated by sobs and sighs, by cold silences and fearful hesitations, those awkward, unhappy, often unfinished conversations. Unfinished conversations are where the truths articulated so eloquently in the campaign, that's where they were first uttered, those words, and it was through them that gay men and lesbians became us, our children, our families. Looks like a victory for liberal Ireland over conservative Ireland, but it's much more significant than that. It's the end. It's the end of that whole sterile, useless, unproductive division. There's no longer a liberal Ireland and a conservative Ireland. The cleavage between rural and urban tradition and modernity that has shaped so many of the debates of the last 4 decades has been repaired. Instead of liberal Ireland, conservative Ireland, we've a decent, democratic Ireland. While it took time, and while it may look like a defeat for religious conservatives, but nobody has been defeated, nobody's been diminished. Irish people comprehensively rejected the notion that our republic is a zero-sum game, that what is given to one must be taken from another. Everybody gains from equality, even those who didn't think they wanted it. Over time, those who are in a minority on this issue will come to appreciate the value of living in a pluralist democracy in which minorities are respected. By pushing forward on what only recently seemed a marginal issue, the LGBT community has given all of Irish democracy, and I will add here, Western democracy, one of its greatest days. And now I am delighted to return to our friend, Canadian poet Mary Sears, with this lovely piece, Stones. A space to fade into, made of stone, dug from the ground by hands, by believers, cleared from the earth, cleaned, carved, chiseled, shaped, fluted, curved, fitted into place, years of labor, but at night the windows darkened, blend into the stone. Inside the flicker of tiny candles, glow of a distant galaxy powered by prayers that flow into the dark chapels. Does grace fill the vaults or flying buttresses where each stone resists the other, pushing downward these words of prayer, causing them to rain upon the soul of the one lost, the one fearing? They are stone with an outlook black as obsidian. Well, now I hope you, as we thank our wonderful friend, poet Mary Sears of Canada, I hope you dig the contrasts among some of today's pieces. Oh, I know you're clever out there. I know that you know why I've chosen some of these to be presented together. And I want to wrap. I rarely do this. You know I rarely do this. But I want to wrap as I opened. Because by my lights, there's little more important than the effort to maintain our nation as a secular democracy, push back hard against those who turn it toward theocracy, religious domination by any religion. So again, I wrap with this New York Times Tuesday front page headline: Evangelicals open door to debate on gay rights. Aside from the foolishness of imagining rights as gay, as black, as Jewish, as women's, as Native Americans, civil rights are diminished the moment we minimize them with adjectives. The noxious notion that any religious group gets to weigh in meaningfully, dispositively, on the constitutional standing of citizens in a secular democracy sullies our exceptionalism and is at best absurd. And I want you to think. I want you to think on your stories, your essays, your poems. Let Passionate Justice give them added, broadened life. Send them to me, Jonathan Wolfman, 01@gmail.com, or jwolf41387 at AOL.com, and follow this program on Twitter at jwolf41387 on Twitter. You see, you have so much more. You have Passionate Justice. All the while, you keep trying to live as if justice matters, as if what your kids and what you do, it matters. Be creative, courageous. Take your place on that great Mandela, next to Bud Clayman, Jerry D'Annunzio, Kim Bellware, Arthur Delaney, John Guzlowski, Peter Montgomery, Mary Sears, and me. Because this is, it is our brief moment of time. Listen to Phil Oakes. Listen to that wonderful, tortured poet and his marvelous number. I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. He was right. Repair this crazy place. You can. I promise. I promise when you act on justice's behalf, it pays back, and it will most definitely make you happy. Watch for and listen to our 84th on our Salon Radio, and follow the show on Twitter at jwolf41387, because there and everywhere it's passionate justice.